Hi everybody, my name is Joey Cross. I am here to talk about Biblical Hebrew in the OI's Continuing Language Seminar Series. Here's what we're going to talk about today. Why that term, Biblical Hebrew? What does it mean? What are the basic features of Hebrew as a language? What are our sources for Biblical Hebrew? And I'll end with sharing a few examples of Biblical Hebrew manuscripts at the OI. So let's get started. Why Biblical Hebrew, and what does that mean? We have to distinguish between stages of the Hebrew language. Biblical Hebrew is one of them. It's also the first. Biblical Hebrew, in fact, is the source and the sort of wellspring of all subsequent stages of the language. Hebrew is a natural language just like any other. It evolves over time. It's spoken by different types of people. It's used for creating literature. There's different dialects and different types used at different periods of time, even simultaneously. But what's so unique about Hebrew is the prominence of the Hebrew Bible as a source for the language. So Biblical Hebrew stands at the beginning. It's also the language that's been preserved throughout the entire history of Hebrew in this textual form of the Bible. So, for example, the next phase of Hebrew that we can distinguish after Biblical Hebrew, Mishnaic or Rabbinic Hebrew, is more evolved in linguistic terms than Biblical Hebrew, but it also interacts thoroughly with Biblical Hebrew. We also can talk about medieval Hebrew. There's modern Hebrew, a contemporary spoken language. These are all different. And knowing modern Hebrew, for example, doesn't mean you can read Biblical Hebrew. You obviously have an advantage, but they're different languages, and the same goes in the other direction. Just because you know Biblical Hebrew and have studied it doesn't mean you can read modern Hebrew. So, Biblical Hebrew as a title is a bit ambiguous. Obviously, it refers to the Hebrew of the Bible, and by Bible I mean the Hebrew Bible, in what the Christians call the Old Testament. This is the language that's preserved in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible. When we say Biblical Hebrew, we're basically meaning ancient Hebrew. All of our ancient Hebrew texts are basically in the same dialect of Hebrew that is seen in the Hebrew Bible. Not only that, the great majority, the overwhelming majority of ancient Hebrew texts are in the Bible. We do have other Hebrew texts from antiquity that I'll share with you, but most of them are in the Bible, and so Biblical Hebrew biblical is our term, and it just dominates the study of ancient Hebrew to such an extent, unlike any other sort of language. If we compare Greek, for example, there's classical Greek, which sometimes you'll hear the word classical Hebrew as an analogy. This is the Hebrew spoken in this age that's defined as sort of normative, and it's a phase of the language that's learned as a language of learning and tradition. That's classical Greek and classical Hebrew. Classical Greek has a lot of distinct dialects. There's Koine eventually. There's the classical dialect of Athens. There's Ionic. There's Doric. Hebrew doesn't necessarily work that way. There likely were different dialects spoken even at the same time, but they didn't leave too much of a mark on the written record. So it's harder, although you can make distinctions between types of Hebrew, but really we can just talk about ancient Hebrew as one thing. So going off of what I was saying about the sort of mutual knowability of ancient and modern Hebrew, there doesn't really exist. Biblical Hebrew, it's important to remember that it's an ancient language that's no longer spoken. The people who spoke Biblical Hebrew are no more. Nobody speaks Biblical Hebrew as a natural language like you can speak Spanish or English. So that means that we have to reconstruct Biblical Hebrew. It's not just known to us automatically like French or Spanish is known to us. And even when we compare, let's talk about English, the English of Beowulf or Shakespeare to us today, or Chaucer, we can sort of reach back and understand through our own language what that language meant and how it worked. It's a bit different for Hebrew. There's a much longer gap of time. And like I said, the later Hebrew languages, especially modern Hebrew, are sort of fashioned deliberately with ancient Hebrew or Biblical Hebrew in the background. So ancient Hebrew is a language that is its own thing, and it has to be studied and reconstructed by scholars. Now, we have a real leg up in that respect. There are lots of important oral and textual traditions that bear biblical Hebrew language that we can rely on. I'm talking about the Hebrew Bible. These texts, which are ancient but are transmitted over centuries, have been preserved along with pronunciation traditions and other sort of grammatical traditions, so that even though the language is no longer spoken, the language of the Bible is no longer spoken, it's still part of a sort of living tradition. So that's a huge way that we can, that's a huge resource for us to leverage for understanding biblical Hebrew. We also have ancient texts that translate biblical Hebrew into languages that we might know also, like Greek, so we can understand how ancient Hebrew knowers and speakers, what they thought about the language and how they use the language when we compare it to other contemporaneous languages. Finally, we can turn to other Semitic languages to help us understand what's going on in biblical Hebrew. Even though 99.9% of the biblical Hebrew corpus is thoroughly understood, there are the occasional word that you have to turn to other related languages to really understand what it meant in the Bible. It might be very different from what it meant in Mishnaic or medieval or modern Hebrew. So, for example, Arabic, which is another Semitic language with an equally long, less but very long chain of sort of spoken transmission, we can use Arabic to help us understand and sort of triangulate some other parts of ancient Hebrew. So biblical Hebrew itself is not one thing either. I'm just making it more and more complicated. When we look at the Hebrew Bible, which is a collection of literature written over centuries, there is some linguistic variation. So there's not just one Hebrew of the Bible, even though most of it conforms to what we would call the standard or classical dialect. So standard biblical Hebrew. So the book of Genesis, the book of Kings. This is the majority of the texts that are preserved. This is the dialect they're written in. Occasionally you get glimpses of maybe a more archaic stage of the language. Those are more difficult to discern. You also see phases of Hebrew in the Bible itself that are more evolved from that classical phase. So books that we know were written relatively late in the game, like Chronicles or Ezra and Nehemiah, they're written in the same Hebrew language as Genesis and Kings, which were written earlier, but linguists can trace characteristic evolutions of the language that show that this language was still living and evolving. And when it sort of touched down at this moment of, let's say, Ezra and Nehemiah into a written form, into a literary form, it not only continued this tradition of classical Hebrew, but some of the more advanced spoken language seeped in. Finally, before we look at more sort of aspects of the language of Hebrew, where did this word come from, Hebrew? So originally, Hebrew was a name for a group of people that lived in Palestine. You could maybe call it an ethnic term, or maybe a social term, a definition of a type of people that populated the southern Levant, Palestine, in the later part of the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. This is glimpsed in the Hebrew Bible, where it's connected to the people of Abraham. So it's an ethnic term that is eventually equated or uses a synonym for the Israelites. So Israel is the name of a kingdom in the ancient Levant, and an Israelite is an inhabitant of that kingdom. Well, Hebrew is a name for a type of person who could be an Israelite, and so the two were used synonymously throughout the Bible. Hebrew as a name for the language spoken by these individuals, we don't have evidence of that until a bit later, so maybe in the 1st century CE, in fact. So some texts start to refer to the language of the Israelites as Hebrew. Earlier it was probably referred to as like Judean or Israelite, something like that, because usually you equate the language with the people who speak it, and the people, an easy way to name the people is the kind of nation they live in, the name of the nation. So Hebrew kind of has an interesting history. It starts out as this almost ethnic name that gets taken into the Bible, and it's part of ancient Israelite and Judean tradition, and then it sort of becomes the way to designate the language itself. That's where Hebrew comes from. But let's take a close look at the language itself and some of its features. So in the grand scheme of things, in sort of the widest view we can really take, Hebrew is a Semitic language. It's a Semitic language which itself is part of a large language family called Afro-Asiatic. and these are languages spoken in Africa and the Middle East. The most ancient example we have attested is Egyptian. So Semitic, and therefore Hebrew, is related to ancient Egyptian. Now, they're not super close. Students of both can definitely discern a few words that seem similar. But if you think of it as a large family tree, Semitic and Egyptian have a very distant ancestor. So we might say they split off at a very early date, well before writing. So we don't have any sort of written record of a time when Semitic and Egyptian were close. If we get more specific about Hebrew, Hebrew is a Semitic language that we would call Northwest Semitic. The Northwest Semitic languages are all located in the Near East or in the ancient Middle East, specifically in the Levant. I'll show you a map in just a second. I've got them all listed here. We can organize the Northwest Semitic languages. Again, these are all languages that have close affinities. They're related to each other, maybe like French and Spanish are Romance languages, right? These languages are related even more closely than French and Spanish. They're very similar, especially when you get into the Iron Age. Anyway, these are branches off of the Semitic, the big Semitic family tree that are localized in the ancient Levant. The earliest one we know is called Amorite. We don't actually have Amorite texts. We just know Amorite as a language because we see it in people's names. It's really interesting. Ugaritic and Old Canaanite are both the earliest attested Northwest Semitic language in writing. We know these from the Late Bronze Age. But then Hebrew and other languages like it start to show up on the record in the Iron Age. So Hebrew, Phoenician, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, these are languages that are all incredibly similar. We call them Canaanite. They're part of the Canaanite family. Let me put my map up here. We can localize them, all these languages, in the southern area of the Levant, what we call Palestine, starting in the Iron Age. So what's the Iron Age? The Iron Age is this period after this major empire era where Egypt controlled, the Egyptian empire extended into the Levant and was sort of constantly coming up against eventually the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, and eventually empires in Mesopotamia also were all sort of interacting, and the Levant was sort of there as the in-between area that was being fought over a lot, especially by the Egyptians and the Hittites. These languages like Hebrew and Phoenician that we have evidence for in the Iron Age, they were probably spoken in some form or maybe a more archaic form in the Bronze Age, but there was no reason to write them down, with few exceptions, Ugaritic being one of them. That's worth another lecture. But there was no real motive or incentive or ability to write them down, to put them in writing, because most writing was controlled by these large empires. So Egypt, and then the ones in Mesopotamia, especially, cuneiform culture. Cities that later would produce writing in these Iron Age Northwest Semitic languages, like Phoenician or Hebrew, they were accustomed to producing writing in very small circles connected to palaces in, let's say, cuneiform. So the Iron Age is a really interesting time because these empires have retreated. Definitely the Egyptian Empire, and we're sort of waiting in the Iron Age for the Assyrian Empire to come up and start to really make its presence felt in the Levant. In that sort of period between empires, you have the ability for local kingdoms to cultivate their own writing. And that's what Hebrew is. So Hebrew is the language cultivated in the very south part of Palestine, in what was the ancient kingdoms of Israel and Judah. Phoenician was cultivated on the coast, this Phoenician area where we have a distinct sort of people living there. Moabite, Edomite, these were languages associated with Moab and Edom. These are states in sort of the area of Jordan in the southern Levant. We also have Aramaic, which probably originated in Syria or northern Mesopotamia and became very prominent in modern-day Syria. The Iron Age is this period when you have all these local languages that are very closely related sort of spring up, and Hebrew is one of them. So we can look at other ancient inscriptions from this time, during the time that the Bible started to be written, and compare them to Hebrew, and we see that they're of a very similar family. Okay, so that's the big scheme, this big scope. Let's just talk specifically about biblical Hebrew before we look at some examples. So, biblical Hebrew is a dialect of Northwest Semitic. It's local to the southern Levant or Palestine, east of the Jordan River. I'm sorry, west. That's a typo. West of the Jordan River. And at its origin, at least on the written record, Biblical Hebrew or Ancient Hebrew is the official language of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. So what are those kingdoms? Those are the kingdoms that descend from in the line of David, right? King David of the book of Samuel in the Hebrew Bible, the legendary founder of this kingdom that then eventually split into two. These kingdoms are definitely known from the Bible, but they're also known from other historical sources, both that have survived in the Levant and monuments also from Mesopotamia. These are small regional kingdoms known from history and the Bible that rose in the Iron Age. And they both ended with the Iron Age also. First Israel, then Judah in 586. Jerusalem was captured by the Babylonians, by Nebuchadnezzar, and the elites were exiled into Babylon. That's sort of the end of Hebrew as connected to a indigenous state of Israel and Judah. Then Hebrew took on a different life. But I'm supposed to be talking mostly about linguistics right now, so I'll put a pause on that. What are some of its characteristics? So Hebrew was traditionally written with an abjad. So that's a term for a type of alphabet. It's more specific than alphabet. Alphabets have writings, have graphemes, have symbols that stand both for consonants and vowels. The Greek alphabet was the first one that had that. The first alphabets, however, did not. The very first alphabet that was really used was invented in Ugarit, and it did in fact write vowels, but that's a bit of a special case. The first alphabet that then took off to become the alphabet was invented by the Phoenicians, then borrowed by the Greeks, and also borrowed by the Hebrews. That alphabet, that writing system, is an abjad because it only writes consonants. So I have examples here. This is the Hebrew script that you would probably be familiar with, that you would see today. This is what it originally would have looked like. This is what we call the Paleo Hebrew script. It looks just like Phoenician because that's where it came from. That's where the writing system came from. So Hebrew and Phoenician are very related, like French and Spanish even more closely. But Hebrew speakers and writers adapted the Phoenician alphabet to write their own language too. So there's a really close relationship there. What are some of its linguistic features? So in Biblical Hebrew, sentences can have the verb, subject, object, word order. They can also have a subject, verb, object, word order, and that can be sort of manipulated by the speaker. Verbs in Hebrew do not show tense in the verb form itself. Tense, if it's present, future, or past, that's something that you have to discern based on other clues, like context. Verbs primarily are marked, so the verbs themselves are written in a way to indicate aspect. What's aspect? It's an important part of verbs that you use all the time. Maybe you didn't know the word for it, but it has to do with the duration of the action, the nature of the action. So an action could take place over a long period of time, or it could be a one-time thing. That's what verbs in Hebrew mark. Everything else, like tense, has to be gathered from in other ways. But the actual writing of the word, it only marks aspect. And there's basically two types of verb in Biblical Hebrew. There's a verb where you have the person. So let's say I run. The I is added to the verb run either by a prefix or by a suffix. Turns out the prefix ones are the ones that have the iterative, the repeated kind of aspect. The ones where the subject is suffixed, those have more of a one-time aspect. Okay, that's how the verbs work. Nouns are masculine and feminine. There's no neuter. Another feature of Hebrew that's shared by a lot of Semitic languages, nouns can be marked for being definite or not. So if I wanted to say the man, there's not a separate word. We have a word in English, the. In Hebrew, you have a special suffix that you add to the word. And nouns can bear that state of definiteness in other ways without having that special marking added to it. So it is a special category that nouns have. Hebrew evolved a very sophisticated literary language, which is utterly unique in the ancient Middle East for its sort of literary capability, and that you see in the Bible. And what they've done is they've engineered a really flexible system where sentences, clauses. So, a clause is a basic unit of speech with a subject and a predicate. Clauses can be linked one after another in lots of different ways to indicate the kinds of actions that are happening in the narrative. So Hebrew really is fascinating in this respect. And the only other language that's comparable to it that has this kind of a sophisticated clausal linkage system would be Egyptian. Finally, poetry in Hebrew, as in other contemporaneous and similar languages, it's not metered. So when you learned poetry in high school, if you're an English speaker, you memorized sonnets, you read Shakespeare and Milton, and you learned to count stresses and syllables. So an iambic pentameter is bum 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 bum, right? There's none of that in ancient Hebrew poetry. There's no stress. They would have had stress. Stress is a natural way of speaking. But the poems were built on other things. In fact, they were built on what we call parallelism, where single lines of speech, what we would call poetic line, a poetic unit, they're linked to one another in sequence in various creative ways. Some lines will repeat the same idea, but in a new way. Other lines will be contrasting. Sometimes you'll have thoughts grouped in 2 or 3 lines. That's how poetry was built, not by sort of a meter. In the medieval period, actually, you start to see Hebrew poetry that's metrical, like poetry we would recognize from English poetry, but that's a later development. Okay, that's the crash course on the Hebrew as a language. Let's talk about where do we get biblical Hebrew. How is it something that we can read today? Let's start with this purposefully contradictory or sort of nonsensical phrase, non-biblical biblical Hebrew. So remember, biblical Hebrew equals ancient Hebrew. It's just the term we usually use. There is ancient Hebrew that's not in the Bible. So we know of texts written in Hebrew outside of this very complicated sacred scripture tradition that is the Hebrew Bible. Okay, so these go back to as early as the 10th century BCE, maybe, but the height of non-biblical biblical Hebrew, where we see the most of it, is about 700 to 586 BCE, with one exception that we'll get into in a second. So we could call this epigraphic Hebrew because it's all Hebrew that's not in book form. It's found on inscriptions on stone or memorials in graves, let's say. It's found on potsherds. So a really common writing device in the ancient world was you take a broken piece of a pot and you write things on it. It's sort of like scratch paper. Maybe if you're practicing how to write. It's also really good for sending letters. So in fact, the most important group of non-biblical, biblical or ancient Hebrew that we have are letters that have been discovered that were sent between military commanders and other things like that. It's a really important resource for studying ancient Hebrew. And there's quite a bit of them. So letters, we also have different writing practice examples, maybe that students were using. A lot of ancient Hebrew inscriptions are sort of small and ephemeral, so we have labels on vessels and seals, so people's names and titles. We have names for weights. There's an amulet, and maybe some others, but definitely one that I'll show you in a minute. So this is a magical text you wear for protection. And then graffiti, like there's always graffiti, as long as there's writing, so we have some of that also. This is a limited corpus. You could sit down in a day and read it all. Except for the letters, it's all very short and, a lot of it very uninteresting from a literary perspective. From another perspective, of course, these are fascinating glimpses into the sort of rise of this language, in writing at least. But let's just look at a few examples of this epigraphic Hebrew, of Hebrew that exists, that survives from the time that the Bible began to be written, but isn't in the Bible. Maybe the most famous example, it's called the Siloam Tunnel inscription. This was discovered centuries ago in a tunnel that went from a spring outside of Jerusalem into the city itself. And this was probably cut, or it was supervised by Hezekiah, the famous king of Judah, known from the Book of Kings. Hezekiah in the Book of Kings is said to have engineered these sort of new ways of accessing water in the city. It was a liability to have your source of water outside the city walls, because if there's a siege, and in fact this happened, the enemy, in this case the Assyrians, could stop the water and starve the city. So by having the subterranean tunnel that was secret, you could bring fresh water in. So this tunnel seems to have been dug under Hezekiah, and there's an inscription that was found at the east end that commemorates when it finished. And this is what it looks. This is just a picture of the tunnel itself. You can go there today. I'm sure many of you have been there. The inscription itself, it's about this big. It's been removed. It's in Turkey, but there's a copy, a life-size sort of reproduction in the tunnel in situ. So this probably dates to the late 8th or early 7th century BCE. There's a bit of disagreement in scholarship. Some scholars think it might be much later and not in fact ascribed to Hezekiah. Hezekiah is not mentioned. This text just speaks abstractly about the process of opening this sort of stream. But looking at the way the letters are written and the way the language works, this definitely seems to be, I would argue, with most scholars, that it dates to the 8th or 7th century. Here's just a really quick little excerpt. On the day of the breakthrough, the hewers each struck towards his companion, axe towards axe, and the water flowed from the opening to the pool. It's really, really cool record. Really cool inscription. As I mentioned earlier, we have a lot of letters, dozens of letters sent, in most cases, between people who were at military outposts. A very famous group of them is found at the ancient city of Lachish, which is south of Jerusalem. Lachish is famous because of this, because texts like this were found there. It was also destroyed by the Assyrians around the time that they tried to besiege and take over Jerusalem, but they were unsuccessful in that. If you're curious about that story, check out 2 Kings chapters 18 through 20. So we have a lot of letters that were sent to and from this site, which in some cases preserve really fascinating glimpses into the day-to-day military life, into looking for signal fires, into hearing the words of prophets. It's really, really fascinating stuff you should look into. These date from the early 6th century BCE, and they were found in a gate building at this city of Lachish. Maybe the most dazzling ancient Hebrew inscription is this Ketef Hinnom silver amulet. So this was written around, it's debated, and it's impossible to tell for sure, but let's say around 600 BCE. So this is only decades before Jerusalem was besieged and basically destroyed. Okay, so this is towards the end of ancient Judah. 2 small silver scrolls that are about this big were found in a cave in a graveyard in the 70s, 1979, and it took years to actually unroll them and to read them because the silver was corroded. But thank goodness for technology, that was able to happen. And here's one of them, which I've got right here. So this is a good photograph. This is sort of a drawing, a tracing of the letters, and as you can sort of see, this is the alphabet. It's different from the alphabet on the right, which is our more modern Hebrew alphabet. It's been sort of standardized into that. The text here resembles really, really closely a text known from the Bible. In fact, a very famous text known from the Bible. It's called the priestly blessing, sort of in tradition, in Numbers chapter 6, verses 24 through 26. So, still today, many say that this is the earliest biblical text. That's not correct. This text predates the Bible as we know it, although biblical literature was absolutely being written at this time. But we only know the Bible as something that was compiled later. And we know also that the texts we have in the Bible, especially texts like the book of Numbers and one in Genesis, for example, these were compiled by editors from previously existing texts. There's every indication in the texts themselves that they had a different kind of life before they came together in the shape we have them today. So instead of this being a biblical text, this is a glimpse into the kind of text that circulated around in ancient Israel and Judah that were memorized and passed down and eventually compiled into the Bible. And this is an amulet, so this clearly is a very popular and sort of cherished prayer to God that was worn for protection. And we actually have something very similar from Egypt at the same time, where little scrolls were sent out by temples and produced in temples to be worn that sort of guaranteed the protection of a god or goddess. So one of the more fascinating biblical, non-biblical ancient Hebrew texts. Okay, the most groundbreaking, the most epic-making, pivotal group of texts that are not in the Bible, but are ancient Hebrew, come from the Dead Sea area. So I have them marked here on this map. All these little pointers. These are all the different sites where different texts were found. These are the famous Dead Sea Scrolls. Most of them are written in Hebrew. There are some Dead Sea Scrolls written in Aramaic, which was another language at the time spoken by Judeans. There also are some Greek ones. But we're talking about Hebrew today. These are basically, with one very, very small exception, the only texts on papyrus scrolls and leather scrolls that survived from the ancient Levant. Why do they survive? They were buried deliberately in caves in some of the driest parts of the world near the Dead Sea. So thank goodness that that whoever it was decided to hide these texts, and they hid them in a very arid area because they've survived. So there's hundreds of these texts that have been uncovered, most of them in the early part of the 20th century. They date as early as the 3rd century BCE, and they can go until the 1st century CE. A lot of them are associated, it seems, or it's been argued, with the Khirbet Qumran settlement, but this is highly debated still today. We can't really get into that now. These are written in Hebrew. Hebrew, that's the language we'd recognize from the Bible, but also a language that's now a language of tradition. I mentioned earlier that Hebrew ceased being as a language that was connected to a polity once Jerusalem was destroyed in 586. Then Hebrew took on a new sort of journey. And at this stage, in the last centuries BCE, in the beginning of the Common Era, Hebrew was still being spoken. But this is a time when the Bible, as we know it, began to take shape. And so Hebrew was also a language of tradition. It was a classical language. So while these individuals were compiling on scrolls what became the Bible, they were also writing new texts in that traditional language of the Bible. It's a really fascinating time, sort of sociolinguistically. Okay, so about 1,000 texts, distinct texts, have been found in these sites near the Dead Sea. Only 25% of them are ones we would recognize as quote-unquote biblical. So copies, let's say, of Genesis, copies of Jeremiah. The other 75% are books that are not biblical. Now, just automatically you can see how important this discovery was. So most of these texts were discovered in the 40s, the late 40s. And up until then, virtually none of these non-biblical texts were known. Some of them were, but this completely opened up a new realm of research of ancient Judaism and of ancient Hebrew literature. Let's parse this out a bit more. So let's look at those biblical texts. 25% are biblical. Now, why do I have that on quotes? Well, as I said earlier, this is a time, the last few centuries BCE, up till the 1st century of the Common Era. This was a time when the Bible, as we know it, we wouldn't recognize it yet in every way. So before the Bible was compiled in the book form we know it, it existed in a set of individual scrolls. That was the dominant book technology in this part of the world. So the book of Genesis is called the book of Genesis because it was originally its own book, a scroll. Every book of the Bible is like that. When we look at these scrolls from the Dead Sea, they match very well our copies of the Bible that we have preserved after this period. Okay? They match very well. They show us that we have a rich tradition that is accurate, that is reliable. We also get a glimpse into that process of Bible creation happening. So the book of Psalms, if you go to a Bible and open up your book of Psalms, there's 150 of them, you will not find a scroll at the Dead Sea that looks just like that. You will find many that resemble that have a lot of the same Psalms, even in the same order sometimes. But the book of Psalms as we know it was inchoate. It was still happening. It was still in process. And it makes sense because Psalms is a collection of sacred poetry, sacred prayers. So you would have more than one edition. Maybe one person compiled their favorite prayers in one scroll. Somebody else did the same for theirs. Then eventually somebody said, wait a second, we got all these different collections of Psalms. Let's make sure we all have the same. Let's put them all together. Something like that could have happened. So every book of the Bible has been found in some form among the Dead Sea Scrolls, except for the book of Esther, the novella of Esther, which is very interesting. Some of these scrolls are complete. I'll show you an example. This is a photograph of the entire book of Isaiah, and this is the book of Isaiah that you would know. If you're familiar with Isaiah in the Hebrew Bible, this is it, chapters 1 through 66, with some differences, minor wording, spelling differences, but this is Isaiah. It's beautiful. Let's zoom in a little bit. So this is a leather scroll. You can see the stitching. So most of the biblical scrolls, not all of them, most of the biblical scrolls were written on leather because leather allowed you to have a bigger scroll, and it was easier to preserve. It was also more special. It lent itself to sacred literature. So that's what we have here, the book of Isaiah. Most of our scrolls from the Dead Sea are very fragmentary. So here's a copy of Deuteronomy that sort of spans 2 columns in the text. Here's a copy of Exodus. If you compare this copy with this one, you'll notice the script is different. So this one actually preserves that Paleo-Hebrew script that the Siloam Tunnel has. So this is a time period where the scripts that Judeans were using was evolving. This became the standard one. It was actually under the influence of Aramaic. But for a lot of sacred literature, they still used the old typeface, let's say. Imagine today if you decided to copy something out in like that Gothic script you see on diplomas versus the kind of script you see in everyday life. Or cursive writing versus print writing. It's very similar. So we have that going on in the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is another example I want to show before I moved on. This has been a bit newsworthy lately. What was trumpeted as the oldest copy of the Bible. This is a scroll that was burned, and it's sort of just a piece of charcoal here, basically, from Ein Gedi, which is another site along the Dead Sea. This was a scroll, the Book of Leviticus. It matches exactly the Book of Leviticus that we know from tradition. This is what it looked like when it was read, but this took forever, like decades, to figure out because it was burned to a crisp. And so not decades, years. I'm way exaggerating here. It took years to be able to read this. A similar process happened actually with some of the scrolls from Herculaneum from Italy that were charred because of Vesuvius, I believe. So anyway, this is another one of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's not as old as some have said. It probably dates to about the 2nd century CE at the earliest. But it's newsworthy, so I wanted to show it here. So 25% of those scrolls are biblical, 75% are not. And I just wanted to just make that clear before we moved on, because this is an amazing discovery. We now have ancient Hebrew commentaries on what became biblical literature. We have other works that have been later called deuterocanonical or apocryphal. So works like Tobit, Enoch, Jubilees that were known over the millennia since they were written, but not in the Bible. They were preserved in other sort of collections, not in the Hebrew Bible. We actually found ancient versions of them. And then all sorts of other religious writings, calendars, rules, religious poetry, also letters. It's an incredibly rich find. So this is I've given you the basic complete overview of the types of texts you'll find with ancient Hebrew. Let's just finish out by talking about the Hebrew Bible itself. Okay, so our earliest copies of biblical literature in Hebrew come from the Dead Sea. And that's as old as the 2nd century BCE, maybe the 3rd. Where do we start to see the Hebrew Bible as like a book that we would recognize from the way we see Bibles today? The earliest surviving copies are actually from the Middle Ages. They're from about 1000 BCE. That's the oldest complete copy of the Hebrew Bible. And here's the most famous example, the Leningrad Codex. This dates to the early 11th century. This is the standard way that these look. These are the Bibles. They're called the Masoretic Bibles because that's the name for the type of scribe who produced them. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these that have survived in fragments and in whole. And they bear witness to a incredibly consistent and profound scribal and religious tradition that very, very accurately copied these biblical texts from the ancient period all the way through the middle period. And then once the printing press was invented, it was sort of there forever. This is what they look like. This is a fragment from the Cairo Geniza, which was discovered right at the turn of the 20th century. And this was a receptacle used by a medieval Jewish synagogue in Cairo that any text that became ruined that had Hebrew characters on it couldn't be destroyed. Like this one here. Clearly this had some stains on it. It wasn't very legible anymore, so they took it out of their Bible and they put it in this special room to preserve it forever. And that room was discovered and kind of ransacked. And so now we have a lot of text like this. But we'll come back to the Geniza just briefly at the end. The tradition of these Masoretic Bibles is incredibly interesting. I mentioned that Hebrew traditionally was written with an abjad. That's absolutely correct. It's consonants only, but in order to preserve the reading tradition, so the way these words actually sounded, the way the biblical texts actually sounded, scholars in the Middle Ages devised this very rich system of notation, where here all these red dots and markings, these diacritics, those indicate vowels. The blue ones indicate accents, so these would have been chanted in liturgical settings. And then in the green, I actually have indicated textual notes. So the scribes would mark where they thought there were errors in the sacred text. They wouldn't change the text because it was sacred, but if they knew that there was an error, they would make a note. So Hebrew is still a language that's traditionally just consonants, but these markings evolved to make it readable by somebody who hadn't had it completely memorized. Okay, so that's the crash course overview of the Bible. I wanted to really quickly show you a few examples of biblical Hebrew at the OI before I end. So this is a rare example of a scroll from the Dead Sea area that's on public display outside of Israel. This is a fragment of what we would call what used to be called, I guess is still called, an apocryphal composition. So this is an ancient Hebrew religious text that's not preserved in the Bible. Scholars call it the wiles of the wicked woman. And if you're a reader of Proverbs in the Bible, let's say, you're familiar with religious discourse that uses women as a paragon for following the right path or not. And so this one uses them as not. A woman personifies the temptation to abandon this righteous path. That's what this little fragment is about. This dates from about the 1st century CE. We have maybe from the same era, maybe from later, it's unknown, because this was purchased in Iraq by Breasted. This is a stamp that bears Hebrew writing, and yeah, I'm trying to remember did I flip it or not. I did not flip it. This is inverted, so if you try to read it now, it won't make sense, because it was a stamp meant to impress writing on clay. Now, what does it say? This is a verbatim quote from the book of Jeremiah. So Jeremiah chapter 48, verse 11. That's about the land of Moab and the sort of vintage it would produce. So it's possible this is a stamp that sealed up imports of wine, maybe? It's sort of unknown. This needs some more research. Finally, I have 3 examples of pages taken out of Hebrew Bibles that were found in the Geniza. So the Oriental Institute has a couple fragments of Bibles from that Geniza that I mentioned earlier, from Cairo, from medieval Cairo. So this is from the Book of Kings. Look how damaged these are. This is from the Book of Kings also. And finally from the Book of Leviticus. And again, if you zoom in, you can see those markings that are different from the consonants. In fact, they were added by a different scribe. So they had one group of scribes who wrote the consonants, and then somebody else came in and were an expert on all the little dots. An amazing, robust scribal tradition. So that's what we have at the OI. There's more, but those are some of the highlights. With that, I'm going to conclude. I really appreciate your viewing. Thank you for sticking with it. I hope you learned something. I really quick wanted to plug a class I'm going to be doing for the OI starting in late August. Jewish scripts throughout history. So it's a 6-week online class where we're going to study the development of writing in the context of ancient Israel and sort of trace the use of writing and the different shapes that it took by ancient Jews and their predecessors all the way through the Middle Ages. We'll see how far we get. But stay tuned for more info on that class shared by the OI. It should be a lot of fun. I really appreciate your time, and take care.
For over 100 years, the OI has been a leading research center for the study of ancient Middle Eastern civilizations. Join us in uncovering the past and learn about the beginnings of our lives as humans together. Become a member by visiting oi.uchicago.edu/member.